All right. Good evening, Dad.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. So today is Tuesday, April 15th, and what's on your mind? What are you thinking about these days?
um, well, I guess there are an awful lot of things to think about, but um, I went for a walk today and I found myself thinking about these deportations, that have been taking place in the U.S. And that's something that we haven't talked about. Maybe that's something that we should try to shine some light on right now.
Sure. Yeah, I've just been hearing it kind of in the background. I haven't been focusing on it either, so maybe you can enlighten me.
Yeah, well, I don't fully understand all the legal issues. Um, Now, what's happened? Okay, well, there's kind of two different types of deportations that are taking place. That one is focusing on student protesters, generally foreigners, often Palestinians with student visas, and they're being nabbed and just sent back to whatever country they came from. Yeah, they're usually students, but sometimes I think there was, for example, a professor or researcher at Brown University who attended Nasrallah's funeral in Lebanon, which, by the way, something like a third or nearly half of the population of Lebanon attended. Um, Quite an extraordinary event. But when she came back, this fact had somehow been probably discovered by some Zionist group. What's happening is that these Zionist groups are feeding information to ICE, to the immigration authorities in the U.S., and they're using these lists, as far as I can understand, to nab people. They're being directed to certain people. Again, people who, protested the genocide, were part of the campus protests that took place, you know, roughly a year ago. Um, and yeah, they're not being charged with anything. They're just grabbed. Probably the most famous case was the Columbia student, Palestinian, who
Or
was,
Syrian, right?
well, I believe he's Palestinian.
Oh, it could be
I think
Palestinian origin or
yeah, he lived for a while in Lebanon, if I remember correctly, and then he may have lived somewhere else. But that's really not particularly important. He was a leader in the kind of like pro-Palestinian, anti-Zionist protests that took place in Colombia. That was probably kind of the epicenter of the student protests, and he was a leader of those protests. So he was grabbed. He has a wife here in this country who, I heard nearly a month ago was 8 months pregnant, so she may have given birth. And he was sent off to a facility in Louisiana, and it seems likely that he's going to be deported overseas. Um, Now, again, he was not charged with anything. And it's clear actually that none of these people broke any laws, because it's obviously not against the law to protest in this country, to express your opinion about something. So the authorities are careful not to list any charges. But what they're relying on is the fact that, okay, these are not citizens. And the immigration authorities just have kind of an arbitrary power to make decisions to send somebody back overseas. Apparently that they have that authority. So uh, it's their non-citizenship status that makes them vulnerable. So anyway, that's one group of people that is kind of has been the focus of administration deportation efforts, and the other are these so-called gang members, many of them from Venezuela, and a lot of them have been rounded up and deported. Um, Now, the thing is that most of these people, if they were didn't have any legal status. In other words, if they were illegal aliens, I really don't think you can make an argument. Okay, if you're an illegal alien, this is true in any country in the world, you don't have a right to remain in the country that you have, illegally entered. But the great majority of these people do have legal status. They were I think many of the Venezuelans were granted some special status, under previous administrations. Well, whether or not that was wise is in a way beside the point. They are in compliance with the law, and yet they're being grabbed, just and deported. On the claim, the claim is that they're gang members, and maybe some of them are, perhaps even a majority of them are. I'm really not sure, but there is no way for us to know because they're not going through any kind of due process. They're not, making a real effort, following some sort of procedure to determine their gang affiliation or lack of gang affiliation. In some cases, it's obvious that they have not followed any procedure and even have violated law. They have, one example. There was this man that was deported to El Salvador. It was claimed that he was a gang member, but that's thrown around a lot. But I haven't seen any evidence. Maybe he is, but I just haven't seen any evidence, and it doesn't seem like they made any good faith effort to determine whether or not he really was. But he had entered the country illegally, like back in 2011. But he had received what's called a withholding of removal order, that was issued by a judge. So actually, the judge had declared, okay, he cannot be removed. We have to, I don't know if further investigate or whatever. But he was deported in spite of this, in spite of this withholding of removal order. And then it was admitted afterwards that, oh yeah, okay, we made a mistake. We weren't aware of this. So he was deported wrongly, clearly without due process. But then when it was his wife, brought this lawsuit against the government said, well, we can't do anything about it now. He's in El Salvador. And that seems to be, I'm sure they can do something about it. Obviously the administration has a lot of influence in El Salvador and could bring him back if they wanted to, but they're not. So anyway, this is what we're looking at right now.
Are you concerned about where this is going to go? That this is just the beginning, that we are losing the rule of law? What's the biggest concern for you right now?
Well, yeah, that's what I was thinking about. And I'm not completely sure. Again, I think like, especially with the case of the students, that I want to make it clear, I have no sympathy with these deportations, and I understand why these students protested. If I was a student on, one of these campuses, I would have been protesting too, and so I'm not saying that they did anything wrong, but they are students, they're here on a student visa. They're in essence guests, of the country. And so the country does have kind of the right to determine your, to send you back if the government decides that you're not the kind of person that went in your country. And, I can imagine, just let's say if an American's in another country, he takes part in the protests and then he gets, sent back to the U.S. I might not lock it, but I say, well, you were a guest in that country. That's the way it is. So let's see, on one level, just sort of, you can say, well, because of their status as, as students, they should be aware, again, that they don't have the protections of a U.S. citizen. They are here just, as guests. Just like when you're a guest in a house, you have to be extra careful how you behave. Again, I don't think they did anything wrong, but that's just kind of the truth of it. It's just like if you step on somebody's toes in the other country, you might go. But at the same time, yeah, it makes you kind of worried because it's just the fierceness with which this administration is going out after people who protest, whether they're students or they're U.S., foreign students or U.S. citizens, it doesn't matter. They're going after all of the protesters, with a real ferocity. And so another part of this, let's say of this attack on expressions, criticisms of Israel and Zionism, is the defunding of American universities. So that's happening in tandem with the deportations. So these various campuses that were the scenes of these protests are being told that, okay, you have to, if you don't comply with this list of demands, and it often means like you maybe have to drop this program, or whatever, you have to institute like an anti-Semitism monitor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If you don't comply with this list of demands, we're not going to provide your university with federal funds. I think in the case of Columbia, we're talking about $400 million. And just yesterday, it was announced that $2 billion of federal aid to Harvard is being frozen. And every one of these universities has caved in until Harvard. Harvard actually refused to cave in. And the result is they lost, this $2 billion and I think more. So, yeah, because the thing is, look, what separates me from those student protesters or from those foreign students? Well, I have citizenship. But it does kind of make you worry. It's like when they're going after, again, with this real ferocity, with this real hatred, that's what you seem like. They don't care. You have a wife who's 8 months pregnant. We don't care. You didn't break any laws. We don't care. We just don't like you. We're grabbing you and we're sending you home. And I think there is a cause for concern. Maybe, you could say there is a kind of a wall that separates us, and that's a wall of citizenship. But you kind of worry if that wall is actually going to hold up against this assault. And, at some point it's going to go farther. And, there's, again, the defunding is going to have a chilling effect. And I don't think it's going to stop with what we see. So, yeah, I think there's reason to worry. Maybe it won't. Maybe it'll never, citizens will never be nabbed, and we'll maintain our free speech rights. But yeah, there's reason to be concerned.
Yeah, it is scary. I think about it sometimes as well, just with the topics we discuss and the videos I post on YouTube, and I think about what I can put in the title or in the description, because I sometimes do get concerned that we could be flagged for something and suppressed or demonetized. Like that's the fear of the next step is to start controlling. Okay, we got to combat this anti-Semitism is what they're saying. I know they set up some anti-Semitism department now. I forget who's leading it, and they're now like screening social media posts for people that are looking to immigrate to the United States to see if they have any anti-Semitic posts, basically criticizing Israel, and then that will be grounds to not let people come into this country, it is scary. But at the same time, I think it's a sign of weakness, though, on the Zionist front. They know that, like you said, the ground is shifting under their feet. People are becoming aware that, okay, there's this problem with Israel and our relationship with Israel. And the more that they try to suppress it, I think it's just going to expedite the demise of Israel and Zionism. Don't you agree? Like this is maybe this is actually for as awful as it sounds, as scary as it is. Maybe this is for the better, because it's especially a lot of people on the right. They were always championing free speech. Like this is what they were saying with the left, how they were suppressing everything, which was true. And then the right comes into power, and immediately, just a couple months in the presidency, it's like, okay, you can't criticize Israel, no protests on the campus. We established anti-Semitism laws. It's like, whoa. Like, well, we were all about saying you can say abhorrent things if you in this country, and it's protected. As long as you're not directly calling for violence, that's a pillar of this country. And a lot of people on the right were about that. I don't think they'll be able to pull this ruse so quickly. I think people will see through it, right?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it's again, it's I think maybe. Well, I was going to say maybe you can point out that, well, they're careful to like at least comply with the letter of the law. Okay, they're going after people, non-citizens and so forth. But I don't. I think maybe I'm splitting hairs there. It is an attack on free speech. It's a certain kind of expression that they don't like, they don't tolerate. A lot of people have pointed out the hypocrisy of that, and I'm sure many people see it. And another thing too is that of course, on the right, there's been an attack on DEI, but now they want to have these anti-Semitism, monitors or departments, and it's really the kind of like the DEI of the right.
Right.
Again, the hypocrisy is apparent. I think everybody can see it. I think that they are acting in a, the kind of the very, the manner in which they're going about this. I think you're right. Does reveal their weakness. It's just that they have to resort to brute force, and because they are losing the battle online. We're seeing that, especially with the younger generation. We're talking about the younger generation again. Really everybody under 50. Really they are losing that battle, and I don't think this is going to win it for them.
No, it's going to make it worse.
Yeah.
So the writing is on the wall. And the last podcast we did was quite depressing, talking about just how terrible everything was in Gaza.
Yeah.
But the bright side, if we just can just put
The
a
silver
pause, just
lining.
the silver lining, is that what's happened is so horrific in Gaza, and the world is seeing it and waking up to it. And the fact that you have these Zionist groups in the United States that clearly have are holding on to all the levers of power in the United States, and they're beginning to pull them.
Right.
People can see it now. People can say, you can't criticize Israel in any way. We will punish you, and then it's going to backfire. So I think what we are seeing is it's the beginning of the end of Zionism. I don't see them turning this around at all. I don't see how Israel can survive after this. Do you think so?
No, I agree. I think they're losing the intellectual argument, the moral argument. What they have is military force, and they have, like you say, their hands on the levers of power. And, they can maintain their power that way for a time. But I think it's, that time is limited. That time is running out. I was thinking also another hypocrisy is, again, on the right, we're supposed to be about sovereignty. Again, make America great again. I think you could make an argument. Again, it's like these people, this foreign student or maybe this immigration applicant. We don't want this because this person or these people because they're against core American values. Well, what is it? Support for Israel is supposed to be a core American value, apparently. But, how is this about American sovereignty? It isn't. This is actually, you could very, I think, reasonably make the argument that these deportations and this defunding, this is all done actually really for Israel, for Netanyahu even. There are Israelis that are uncomfortable with this. In general, the left is. We're talking about kind of imposing the will of a right-wing Israeli government. How is this making America great again? How is this about American sovereignty? How is this a core American value? And again, I think it's just some people will never see the hypocrisy of it, but I think especially the younger generation is seeing it. And so, these moves are just going to contribute to that awareness among them.
Right. Well, it's very frustrating because if you're concerned about anti-Semitism, nobody in the government, nobody in power or in the media is addressing the root cause of the rise in anti-Semitism. No one's addressing the fact that it's directly tied to what's happening in Gaza and what's happening to the Palestinians. They're suffering. It's right there. And that refusal to acknowledge that is just going to turn more and more people against Israel and against Zionism because it's silly.
Right, which isn't necessarily anti-Semitic. It's kind of a But yeah, you're absolutely right. If you're Jewish and you're afraid, that you might become a victim group once again, you ought to be fighting tooth and nail, against the policies of the Israeli government. And of course, there are quite a few Jews that are doing that. People like Max Blumenthal, who are the fiercest critics of Zionism right now.
Okay, so I think we're in agreement that Zionism is dying. The Israeli state will most likely not survive in the, I don't know, I don't want to give a timeline, but it won't survive. But what will that mean when it goes down? How will the United States, will we be like liberated? Will we feel like, oh my goodness, like or will it tear the country apart?
Yeah, I don't know, because yeah, again, those people that support Zionism, they're powerful and they're passionate too. This is not something like in some cases you have, let's say, an establishment that's kind of, that has been running on fumes for a long time. It's their, um, well, because it was always there. But the passion from it is gone. I think you can say that was true of the Soviet Union at the end. And so it was just when it was challenged, when you when some minor reforms were initiated, the whole thing just came crashing down because it turned out that it was just it didn't really have any life left in it. But Zionism does have a lot of life left in it. Unfortunately, it is. There are many people that are passionately attached to it, and many of those people are very, very powerful. Um, Now we have, passionate people on the other side, and they're growing in number. So I don't know. I certainly hope for and pray for a peaceful revolution of some kind. But uh, I don't know. It's not going to be easy. It's going to, and when it happens, it'll be a major earthquake that really, um, just changes the American landscape. So many of the things that we're talking about, we see the whole world changing, these great tectonic shifts that are taking place, as a multipolar world arises and the old, unipolar world, begins to fall. That's what we're witnessing on when we look at the world stage. But within the U.S., we have this great real battle between Zionism and its opponents, and that is, it's not entirely a domestic struggle because it's obviously linked to what's happening overseas. Especially very, very much so in the Middle East. Um, but this is a struggle. The like Russia is a long, long ways away, and though the conflict there in Ukraine is certainly going to have an impact. In the end, it could have a very, very large impact. Like on the dollar and a lot of the other things that we've talked about. But it's not going to be felt so directly and it's not so much a part of our identity. Let's just put it that way, because I was just criticizing the idea, of course, that you're making some like support for Zionism a core American value, but for a lot of people it is, and that they would say that. It seems like an extraordinary claim, but they would actually openly embrace what I just said. Oh yes, this is a core American value. So you often see, Israeli flags and American flags together, and when that identity is challenged and it is finally that identity again is very, very is not something out on the fringes, but is at the center of power. That's challenged. This is going to be something that really rips America apart. I hope that it's going to be an earthquake within America that you could say is kind of like that echoes or is the equivalent of the greater geopolitical earthquake. And I don't know. I find it very hard to predict how it's going to happen. Right now, it's hard to imagine America without, this intense devotion to Israel, because it's just so much a part of everything so much a part of the establishment, but not just the establishment. As we said, like here we are in the South, you do see Israeli flags around. They're in churches and on, bumper stickers. And
Hmm.
I, I
Yeah.
really, all I can say is it's going to be huge, and I think it's inevitable, just because of the trends that we're observing now. But I don't know how it's going to play out.
Are there any historical parallels we could draw from, or is this truly a unique
No,
relationship?
I think a lot of people have pointed out this is unique. You can't really, it's hard to find, including Mearsheimer, who's, wrote with Stephen Walt, the book, the Israel Lobby. This is unique. It's hard to find that a great power like the U.S. really subordinated its interests, to a very minor power. Israel is a very small country. I don't think it's ever happened before. He couldn't think of any example of that, and I can't either.
So it's truly uncharted territory.
Yeah, right.
It's
Yeah, it would be
interesting.
nice if you could find something, in the past. Yeah, okay, there was, this great empire, and there's that subordinated its interest to this small state, on the other side of the ocean. Uh, but no, I don't think we can find that anywhere else.
It's amazing how that ever happened, how we
Yeah,
allowed that to happen. It's
yeah, no, it
could
is.
you
It's quite
could
amazing.
you maybe this is a tall order. Could you recap that in like 5-10 minutes for us, or is that too much
Well,
to?
and maybe it's too much, but I'll just point to a few. Um, I think a few key moments. One was Truman's decision to recognize the state of Israel. He had actually had a lot of advisors who urged him not to, but he did it for domestic political reasons. It was the Jewish vote and Jewish money, and he admitted to it. That's why he did it. Okay, that was one thing. But then, at that time, when you're talking about the late 40s, the 50s, and the early 60s, you couldn't say that the U.S. was subordinate to Israel. Um, the in those years, America understood it was the greatest power, on the planet, and it actually behaved accordingly, including, in relation to Israel. So you had the Suez Canal crisis back, I think it was 1956. Um, it was an attempt actually to seize the Suez Canal by Israel, allied with France and England, the UK. And it involved the Levant affair, which was a false flag operation carried out by Israel, recognized by everyone to have been a true false flag. But Eisenhower saw this happen, and he just pulled the plug on it. And he didn't, there wasn't an Israel lobby at that time. He said, this doesn't make any sense. This is wrong. You guys aren't doing this. And so the whole, the the attempt fell flat on its face. Israel had to retreat, and both France and the UK were humiliated. Um, but I would point to the watershed moment where we, where we really did subordinate our own interests to Israel, to the USS Liberty attack in 1967. This was at the start of the 1967 war, and that the USS Liberty came under attack by Israel. Had an American flag flying. Kept on sending it. There's no question they knew it was an American ship, and they tried very hard to sink it, but it was because of the very courageous and heroic behavior of some of the crew members that the ship was saved. They were able to get a distress signal out, and eventually got help from a nearby. I think planes flown from a nearby aircraft carrier. In fact, I actually know somebody who was on that aircraft carrier when that happened in the Mediterranean. Um, Now the thing is, right? Well, this was Israel attacking a U.S. ship. They killed, I believe, was it 34, 37 members. A total of like 170 were injured. The ship was very nearly sunk. It could have been a lot worse. It was bad enough as it was, but it could have been a lot worse. Everybody, could have drowned on that ship. Um, and the a real nation that took its put its own interests first in a proper sense. I'm not saying you have to be ultra nationalist or anything. That it has a sense of its own dignity and the concern for its own citizens would have been outraged. Our government, should have expressed that outrage and made it clear to everybody what happened. This was perfidious behavior on the behalf of by the Israeli government. But Lyndon Johnson, who was president at that time, chose to bury the whole thing. And in fact, all the surviving crew members were told not to say anything about it. But eventually they did start talking, and they have they have their own organization right now, and they try to educate people about it. And they sometimes do get through, they sometimes manage to reach, other fellow members of the military, but a lot of people just don't want to hear it. And in general, there's an effort, that most people are not aware of what happened. But I would point to that incident. It's like where we ceased to become, where we actually did willingly, I think this has to be pointed out. It was a choice on the part of Lyndon Johnson, and his administration to do this. He was not forced to do it. He could have, America was strong. Israel was relatively weak. Okay, I think there was already something like an Israel lobby that was growing in power, but it wasn't like it is now. He could have said no. He could have shined a light on this horrible event, but he chose not to. It was like a voluntary subservience. And I think that's really where it began, where this extraordinary chapter in American history, began with the USS Liberty in 1967.
What an awful president.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, something I was thinking about in our last episode, we said there's really just not much hope for Gaza. And I think that's probably true. But maybe one thing that we didn't touch on that could be some hope for the Palestinians is just the own political division and unrest going on in Israel right now. And I imagine that's only going to intensify, especially as they are beginning to lose support in the United States, amongst the people, maybe not amongst the administration, but the administration's going to have its hands full with trying to stamp down their so-called anti-Semitism, which is just criticism of Israel. And I think that is going to further fuel more and more anxiety within Israel and more unrest and division and anger at what Netanyahu's doing. And this could potentially fracture the whole society. There's, who knows, civil war, whatever. What do you think of the possibility of getting a solution internally within Israel, just because there'd be so much strife in that country?
Well, there is. Israel is a very, very divided society, and the emotions, are running high on both sides of the divide. You have armed forces on both sides of the divide. The police force is basically under the control of Ben Gvir, and it has become increasingly, an ultra-nationalist, ultra-Zionist, and with a particular, religious coloring that you find, with Ben Gvir and his ilk, and then. But at the IDF, I think it's fair to say it's like it itself is divided. You still have the old guard that is kind of secular and kind of Western liberal leaning, but there is a lot of the younger recruits and some of the commanders too have been replaced. They have new political appointments. People that are much more in tune with Netanyahu and the right-wing coalition. The IDF, my understanding is that it's divided. And then you have these organizations like Shin Bet, which is basically the FBI of Israel, and it is still the old guard. It's essentially it's the old Israel. But it's under attack. Netanyahu attempted to fire the head of Shin Bet recently and to put somebody in, who he felt was personally loyal to him and to his coalition. That has encountered obstacles, and so the firing or he has not yet been able to appoint that new head of Shin Bet. But you can see, these are and the intelligence agencies, too, are kind of like Shin Bet and part of the old gun. But you have the police and then increasingly the IDF on one side, or a good part of the IDF. And then you have the intelligence agencies, the FBI on the other side. It doesn't, and the feelings are very strong. So, yeah, the Israelis themselves are talking about the possibility of civil war. That could happen. One thing, though, to be aware of is that even with, we talk about the old liberals, they too are Zionists, and in the end, they too, yeah, are in favor of a greater Israel. They just don't want to go about it as fast. And let's be honest, like and the IDF, uh, they carried out this genocide. Maybe they're a little bit to the left of Netanyahu overall, but they carried out the genocide. And if you look at the left in Israel in general, they just are not concerned with the Palestinians. They really couldn't care less about them and their lives. And I think it's a mistake even from their own interest for the reasons that you've given. Like if you're concerned about anti-Semitism, you need to at least show some concern for the lives of these people. But in general, they don't. Now, there are some very honorable exceptions, of course, but they are a very small minority. So the thing is, the whole spectrum is Zionist. It's just, it's kind of different flavors of Zionism. In the end, all of them are in favor of an expansion of Israeli territory. And and so whatever happens, I mean, who knows? If we really do have a civil war, then it's hard to predict the consequences. But my guess is that actually the ultranationalists would win. I think they have more guns on their side. They're more willing to employ violence. So I wouldn't place a whole lot of hope in that conflict. Well,
Right, but it would just further weaken Israel and
yeah,
further its disintegration. You
yeah,
would see more and more people
right,
leave. It'd be harder to drum up support for it. It's
right.
clear that even if you don't
Yeah,
have guns, maybe the PR war would be harder for them to control as well. I think it would be very damaging to them.
yeah, I
Um,
think it would. Especially if the ultranationalists win, it would. It's just for the longest time, it's just sort of like you had these kind of very westernized people that were in charge of Israel, and they knew how to speak to their fellow Westerners and sort of to maybe to cloak some of the uglier aspects of the occupation, and how to spin things and justify things. And it was just like they were very, very good spokesmen, and very good at obfuscating the reality. But people like Ben Gavir, they don't give a damn. And they are probably the Israel of the future. They're Israel of much of the present already. And they speak in a language that is going to, I think, be grating on the ears of Westerners, even those people that are very favorably disposed to Israel. It's going to be an embarrassment. It's going to be hard for them to maintain their support for Israel. And we've already seen some of this, like, we've spoken of the New York Senator, what does his name escape me right now? But
talk about Chuck Schumer.
Chuck Schumer, right. I was almost going to say Shoemaker, but I knew that was wrong. And Chuck Schumer, exactly. That he actually condemned Netanyahu. You felt like people like Netanyahu are giving Israel a bad name. And you do, there are a lot of liberal Jews and liberal. The thing is, there's like Chuck Schumer, he is still very much a Zionist, but he wants to have Zionism with a sophisticated face, you know, and if you had like the Ben Gavirs of Israel really take power, which I think is going to happen. I think that's where think everything's trending in their direction. It may take some years. It may be, who knows, but it may be faster than that. It's going to be hard for the Chuck Schumers of the world to continue to associate themselves with Israel. Now, the scary thing, when you look at these things, is that possibly, like the Ben Gavirs would take over, and the support for Israel will remain. It's just that in the end, okay, we'll drop the pretense of like we've talked about this descent into barbarism already, right? And it's just that the Zionist supporters, they would prefer to have the sophisticated kind of the westernized leaders, but if they lose them, okay, they'll make that. The danger is that they'll just make that commitment to raw, violent Zionism. the descent into barbarism will just continue. Um, but I think you're right. It's just that, yeah, there will be people who go that way, but it is also at the same time, as we can see, causing the revulsion of a lot of other people. And so the split that, that I think that the move towards a more openly ultranationalist and, frankly, ethno-supremacist, racist society is going to be hard for a lot of people to stomach in the West. I hope so. Sometimes I kind of wonder because we've seen the support for Israel so far, and but maybe it's just like as it'll get so extreme, it'll become increasingly difficult. I hope so. Again within the West. Um, but I do have my worries about it. It's just that maybe it's you kind of you hope for a counteraction or a reaction to the extremism within Israel. But the danger is that the extremism in Israel can come back and infect us. And I think maybe, for example, we see that in Ukraine. You say, well, hey, these people are actually, are celebrating Hitler and Bandera and whatever, can't they? Obviously, they're going to be revolted by that, but somehow the Europeans or a large segment of European society, especially the political class, are embracing them. And it seems like rather than being revolted and waking up, it's just like they're becoming infected themselves.
It's a good way of putting it. Okay, well, let's move over to Ukraine and Russia. Then we haven't talked about it much. Um, I don't know if you're up for this, but I was thinking that it could be good to do kind of just a recap. Like if you could explain the Ukraine war in 10 minutes, because I know a lot of people that listen to us, they found us because we were talking about Palestine, Gaza, or they found us from the trade war. And, these other conflicts aren't maybe their cup of tea, but I think it's all part of this bigger global shift to multipolarism. And so I think it's important to understand all these conflicts and what it means and why it's so significant to the world. So do you think you're up for that task now, or do you want to say that later? Can you just do a quick recap and tell us, okay, explain the Ukraine war to us in 10 minutes and why it's something that's important we should be paying attention to?
Okay, well, I think you could say, um, okay, well, we'll go back to 1991, right, when the Soviet Union fell, the Russian Federation was established, um, and Ukraine was granted its independence. Now, part of it was granted its independence with the understanding that it was going to be neutral, and neutral means that it's not going to be a member of NATO. It was actually written into the constitution of the new Ukraine. And we didn't really have any, well, I'll say, there are two things that are going on here, and maybe the two are merging, over time, or that's my fear. Um, Initially, you didn't have any of the hostility or very little hostility towards Russia among Ukrainians. And it must be understood that many Ukrainians identify with Russia. About half of Ukrainians are Russian speakers, and a good 25% of them actually consider themselves to be fully Russian. They're ethnic Russians. And you find these people, especially in the east, in the Donbass, we talk about Donetsk and Lugansk, and in the south, extending over to Odessa, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Nikolaev, and Odessa. Um, so, yeah, Ukraine was, you could say, an ethnically divided society. Now, there were also other ethnic groups like Hungarians, so we're in the east. Um, but that was the main division. But there you didn't have these tensions. There was part of, okay, Ukraine, that's part of what we are. We're Russian, but we're also Ukrainian. And so over in the western part of Ukraine, you have Ukrainian speakers, and the center of that is Lvov. And Ukrainian is a very similar language. I think, the distinction between a language and a dialect can be very arbitrary. And I think like the difference between Ukrainian and Russian is probably a lot less than between different so-called dialects of Chinese. They're very similar languages. And I think you could, if you could ignore the politics, you would consider it to be a dialect of Russian. And you can see it in the spellings and so forth. There's just their brother languages or dialects. Um, Now, initially, this was something that was accepted. This was part of being Ukrainian. It said, yeah, we're Russian over here and we're Ukrainian here. We're brother people. And what we have this, we share this territory and we'll have this future together, right? Um, but from the start, well, there was always a core of what I call Banderites. There were the supporters of Stepan Bandera, who was let's say, an ultra-nationalist leader during World War II who was very closely allied, and actually even more. I think uh, he worked closely with Hitler and he was undeniably engaged. His group was, which is called the OUN, I think the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, in various atrocities. I mean, we're not talking about large-scale atrocities, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Poles, Jews, Russians were killed by his people, and a deliberate ethnic cleansing. He believed in a pure Ukraine. So it would be a Ukraine where free of foreign influences. And, the biggest, the most obvious influence is Russian, because Russia and Ukraine have been tied together for such a long time. But he was in favor of purification. He wanted to have a pure Ukraine, where everyone spoke Ukrainian. And, he was killed, towards the end of World War II. I can't remember the exact date, but this was the one kind of, let's say, European fascist movement that actually remained and continued fighting after the end of the Second World War. There were guerrilla bands that continued to attack Soviet forces even after the war had ended, after Victory Day, which is the 80th anniversary of which is coming up. I guess it's on May 9th. And they were able to continue to fight because they were supported by the West, who, after some years after the end of World War II, ceased to be allied to the Soviet Union and began to regard the Soviet Union as an enemy. So, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And they began to work with these Banderites, and they parachuted some of them in and, sent supplies. And these guerrilla attacks, they went on for years. Eventually, they were entirely suppressed by the Soviet Union. But the memory of these people and the devotion to Stepan Bandera remained. It was, it wasn't entirely snuffed out in Ukraine under the Soviet Union, but it remained perhaps in its most open and maybe intense form in places like Canada and the U.S., where there were a lot of Ukrainian refugees, and they actually very openly kind of carried forward the cult of Stepan Bandera. And there are camps, like I think in New York State, there's a camp, where there's a big statue of Stepan Bandera. It's where, the young Ukrainians get together every summer. They go to a summer camp there and they learn about Stepan Bandera and the end of
Really?
Ukrainian.
In New York?
Yeah, in New York. So
But aren't people aware of the ties to Nazi Germany and the
I think it's always been about geopolitics. Like I was saying, in general, we went after these people around the world and nabbed them. Anybody that had these ties, but an exception was made for Ukraine because this group was useful to the CIA, to the U.S. administrations, because it was a thorn in the side of the Soviet Union. So we used them, and we have a history of doing this. And of course, just like we used Bin Laden and and other jihadists, which, the most recent example is the president of Syria, right? He was our enemy, but now he's our friend. Because he's the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So when the Soviet Union fell, a lot of these Banderites actually went back into Ukraine, from places like Canada and the U.S. and began to, um, to revive the cult of Bandera. And so that was something that was on the fringes, but it was always there, and it grew and it grew and it grew. It um, Now, at the same time this is going on, this is turning out to be more than 10 minutes. I'll try to make it fast here. So I
That's
just want
fine.
to say there was this kind of this internal force, the Banderites, but at the same time, there is this greater geopolitical question, and that was the expansion of NATO. Way back when Gorbachev, agreed to let East Germany go and allow the reunification of Germany. He had an understanding. It was a verbal understanding. A lot of people have denied it, but it's been, it's been corroborated. There have been recent uh, um, documents showing that yes, that it wasn't just something in Gorbachev's imagination. It was actually written down in memos by U.S. leaders at the time. There was a verbal agreement not to made by NATO and by the Americans in particular, not to expand eastward. And it was on that understanding that the Soviet Union really let these countries go, in particular, East Germany. But we did expand eastward, and we kept on expanding. And with each expansion, the Russians protested more and more, but we ignored them because in the 1990s, Russia was just a very, very weak country. In the early 2000s, they're very weak. Now, we had Putin in charge at that time. And and it's not just Putin, this was the entire Russian government, expressed their deep concern about this. They saw this organization, this powerful military alliance expanding right up to their borders. But one thing that they made clear is going, way back is that, we don't like what you're doing. And, but we've just had to accept it, especially because we were very weak, back then. But Ukraine in particular is a red line. You cannot do it. We will not accept it. Ukraine that cannot become a member of NATO. It was through Ukraine that, Napoleon and his army marched. It was through Ukraine. It wasn't actually Ukraine then, but it's a territory that's now Ukraine that Hitler, marched. This is for us an existential issue. There was, in fact, I think, a memo by the CIA. Oh no, he was later the CIA director, Bill Burns. Back then, he was an ambassador to Russia, and he sent this memo back to the U.S. administration. I believe it was 2008. He says "niet" means "niet." It means, in other words, he's saying the Russians are dead serious about this, and that it could mean war. So, the Americans, the Russians were making warnings, and the warnings were getting louder and louder and louder, but the Americans just continued to ignore them. And it was around that time, around 2008, that that NATO declared that both Georgia and Ukraine would become members of NATO. That they were on the path to become NATO members. And again, the Russians were genuinely alarmed by this, and they continued to repeat this warning. Said we cannot accept this. And then we had the coup in 2014, which was, we can't get into the details, but it clearly was, a Western-sponsored coup. It was one of the most open coups in the history of the world, and that coup overthrew, a duly constitutionally elected president, who was Yushchenko. No, it was
Yanukovych.
Yushchenko was the one that preceded him.
Right.
Sorry, Yushchenko was kind of the Western leading one, and then Yanukovych. You're right. Yanukovych is the one he was he was friendly to Russia, but he was in favor of a neutral Ukraine that traded with both the West and the East. But this was not good enough for the Americans and for the Europeans. They wanted to cease. They wanted to make Ukraine part of their bloc and eventually a NATO member. And they took a big step forward with that coup in 2014. And with that coup, that's when the Russians seized, you can say, Crimea. It took very little effort because the Crimeans are just Russians. I mean, Crimea was added to to Russia in the late 1950s by Khrushchev, just as a gift, to Ukraine.
I
And
mean, added to Ukraine.
yeah, I'm
And
sorry,
then,
it was added to Ukraine. It was part of Russia. So this was just a bureaucratic decision. It didn't seem to mean much back then because we're all part of the Soviet Union, but then it became very, or from the beginning, from 1991, the Crimeans made it clear they wanted to be part of Russia. So when this happened, and the Russians had have a very important naval base there, Sevastopol. They made the decision that we just can't risk letting Sevastopol, our main Black Sea naval base, fall under the control of a NATO aligned and eventually a NATO country. And so Putin sent in his little green men. I mean, again, it wasn't an invading army because they were ready to become part of Russia. And later they held a referendum, and I think it was 94% voted for to be a part of Russia. And this is something, that 94% figure is actually supported again by Western polling agencies. There's just no doubt about it. But then shortly thereafter, a civil war broke out in what's the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. It was the people there rose up. They didn't accept this new, the government that they had elected. Yanukovych, the president they elected, he fled in terror because of this coup. And the people in the East, they saw their government taken away from them and they rose up and they demanded autonomy. Immediately the new government called them terrorists and sent in the military, and a civil war broke out. And that civil war went on from, 2014 all the way. It was pretty much frozen, but there was still, fighting along the lines, and especially artillery shelling, 80% of which came from Western Ukraine and went into Eastern Ukraine. The city of Donetsk itself was just continually shelled. And we're talking about thousands of casualties over these years from 2014 to 2022. And it was 2022, of course, when the SMO was launched. And that was, that was launched after the failure of different accords. There was the Minsk I Accord and then the Minsk II Accord. And what this was actually, it was an agreement that was made between Ukraine, between the autonomous governments in the Donbass, and it was also guaranteed by the French and the Germans. And it was supposed to just grant a certain amount of autonomy. I mean, that the Ukrainian government is supposed to recognize their autonomy and provide various guarantees that their language, their religion would be respected. But and this was actually a disappointment to most of the residents of the Donbass. They wanted to be part of Russia, but the Russians, under Putin said, no, you're part of Ukraine. But, we've helped to work out this agreement, whereby your rights will be respected. Now, the Minsk Accords were never implemented. And it was the West, all the parties on the Western side, the French, the Germans, and the Ukrainians all openly said, the presidents from that time, we're talking about Angela Merkel in Germany, Francois Hollande in France, and then Poroshenko in Ukraine. All of them openly bragged about their pulling the wool over the eyes of Putin. You say, well, we never had any intent of implementing. This was just something, to buy time so that we could build up the military in Ukraine and attack Russia and take back those territories, or, to attack the Donbass and take back those territories. That's what it was all about. And again, they said this openly. I mean, all three of them did. Angela Merkel said it twice. So that, the Russians saw this. They saw that there was this continual move to bring Ukraine into NATO. And then, as they said, and an increase in forces on the Ukrainian side. And it's like Lavrov and others have said, they were faced with a situation where a conflict could break out at any time. It could be initiated by the Ukrainians, but if Ukraine was part of the NATO, if the Russians tried to resist, they would find themselves at war with all NATO, and you have World War III. And they said, we just can't let this happen. So that really was, what was behind the SMO, which was launched in February of 2022. And it was clear that even then, I didn't really understand. I think a lot of us didn't understand what was going on then. But a lot of information's come out since then. It was clear that in spite of what you'll hear from the mainstream press in the West, Russia was not trying to seize a lot of territory in Ukraine. They went in with a very small force. It was about 100,000, Russian soldiers, 50,000 militia from the Donbass, which was, much smaller than the Ukrainian forces. But they went up to Kiev, and it was immediately from day one that, like, the Russians contacted of this SMO, the Russians contacted the Ukrainian government and said, let's negotiate. We'll pull this, we'll end this operation, this SMO, quickly, but we have to make a deal. It's just like we've been waiting for 8 years from 2014, but we've got to make a deal. And again, they were willing at that point. The Donetsk and Lugansk had actually declared themselves part of Russia. I say, okay, now you've lost that, but everything else we'll pull out of everywhere else. We'll give it all back to you, but you cannot become part of NATO. We have the same requirement. You have to be a neutral country. And, you have to also abandon the Banderite ideology. That's the so-called denazification. And, they began to negotiate, and they actually reached an agreement. It's what we call the Istanbul Agreement. The negotiations started in Minsk, but they ended up in Istanbul. And there's a lot of people, and eventually a lot of the agreement was leaked to the press. We've seen it. And there were many people present, the mediators, the Turkish mediator, there were like German ex-NATO generals, and Naftali Bennett, the former president of Israel. They were all involved as in these negotiations, working as mediators. And they all said it was the same thing. They did have an agreement, but then the Ukrainians basically walked out of it under pressure from the British and the Americans. And so after that, okay, this very limited military force was there in Ukraine. This was clearly, it was an effort to pressure, maybe it wasn't wise, but it was clearly an effort by the Russian government to pressure the Ukrainian government into an agreement. And it almost worked. At least it appeared that it almost worked. They actually signed the draft, but then they withdrew. And it was what the Americans and the Brits were telling the Ukrainians: we have your back. You can win this war. And they began, the flow of arms. And, to make a very long story short right now, it's just that the Russians, when they saw that, this last effort in negotiation failed, again, had to mobilize, and they knew that at that point they were in for a long war, and that's the war that we're witnessing right now.
Okay. Well, it wasn't 10 minutes, but
yeah, I'm sorry about that.
That's fine. No. I think it's good, even for me, just to go over that history again and be reminded. It's so important to understand the root causes of these conflicts. This is the problem that we have, and I think the problem that we're currently seeing in the inability to reach a negotiated peace settlement with Russia right now is that lack of understanding of the history, the lack of understanding of the root cause of this conflict. The same thing we see with Palestine and Israel. We fail to address the root cause there. We're failing to address the root cause here in Russia. Yeah. And I wonder how the U.S. administration is going to be able to do that, because with Israel and Palestine and Iran, that's a mess, because we don't know who's really in power. If it's just really the Zionists that really control this government completely, they obviously don't want to deal. They don't want to address that root cause. They don't want to have a two-state solution. They want to create greater Israel, and they want to destroy Iran. And so they will try to nuke any type of deal if they can't. They'll do anything they can to just sabotage any type of deal. But when it comes to Russia, we don't have that issue. We have Russia, who has been trying, as you said very well in the past 20, 30 minutes, all these attempts to reach a deal. They've been trying to do a deal for 30 years. It sounds like, ever since the end of the Cold War, this was always what they wanted. And it
Hmm.
sounds like the United States under Trump, he wants to do a deal. It seems
Right.
like he genuinely does want to have this deal. But what we've seen is, despite his promise of 24 hours, he is not. He doesn't seem to be capable of making this deal now. It's getting more and more difficult. It's dragging on. We continue to provide intelligence, continue to provide arms. So why is it that we can't achieve that deal? What is holding it up so much?
Yeah. Well,
Well, I kind of said it with
yeah.
the root cause.
Yeah. Well, yeah, right. Well, that's what the Russians themselves say, that you're not addressing the root causes. They just want a ceasefire. And they say, look, we tried that. That's what Minsk was. We have a ceasefire. And then, and what happened is you use that ceasefire to just to pour arms to Ukraine and to make it kind of a de facto member of NATO. It wasn't, it's not a de jure member of NATO, but you made it into a de facto member of NATO. Now you're asking for a ceasefire again while we're winning, and we've been through that. We don't believe we've made our demands clear. We've been making them clear for a long time, and you've ignored us, and you've ignored us again and again and again, and the agreements that we've reached with you in the past, you going all the way back to the promise, not to expand NATO to the east. You have broken those agreements. You've broken your promises. So we are, yeah, we have every reason, to be very doubtful. We have every reason to demand something solid and upfront, right? Again, like I was talking about the grain deal, I think the last time, and similar to the Iranian situation, it's like we reached this agreement, and you promised to do something, we promised to do something, we did our part, but you didn't keep your promises, and we've seen that happen again and again. So this time, you're going to have to, you're saying that we're being unreasonable and whatever, but we've just learned from experience. You're going to have to meet our agreements, and you're going to have to meet them up front, because we have been burned so many times that, look, it's just, we're not going to do it again. It's not possible, I think, if Putin actually did something like a Minsk 3, there would be I don't know, a palace Kremlin coup or something. It's just the anger against it would be set. So it's the lack of trust above all, and that history, that we just talked about, that the Russians, I mean, rather the Americans need to understand. And it seems like actually Witkoff, who spent a lot of time talking to the Russians, it sounds like he's starting to understand it, and he's trying to tell Trump, and Trump kind of halfway understands it, but it just, he's got other people telling him other things, and I don't know.
So is it basically do we just have to say no NATO? I mean, what do we have to do exactly? What is it that the U.S. has to concede?
That's okay. Definitely no NATO, and it's no NATO ever. There's some ideas. Well, we'll promise not to. We'll wait for 15 years or something. He said no NATO, and then a demilitarization. Which certainly means that you're not going to be sending in troops. Like, French troops, any foreign troops. No, actually the opposite. We got to see, rather you were trying to build up the Ukrainian military, you got to do the opposite. So demilitarization, that was one of Putin's other requirements. And then respect for the rights of Russians and Russian speakers and Orthodox Christians within Ukraine. This is something that you claim as Europeans to, you claim to, regard minority rights as sacred, but like in the case of Russians, you seem to ignore it. But yeah, they have to be, their rights have to be guaranteed. And then the territories that they have actually started off with very minimal requirements. Originally, like back at Minsk, it was just like, we're going to keep Crimea, which again was, which was taken by the Russians in the way that I described earlier. But you could have all the Donbass, everything else. Okay, but then now, that was the offer from 2014 to 2022. But then with the launch of the SMO, Donetsk and Lugansk, which is the Donbass, Okay, the two of them together are the Demise. Okay, those are now part of Russia, but you can have all the rest. That's the offer that we're making to you. But as you know, as the offer was ignored, the war went on, and a lot of Russians have died along with it. Say now it's going to be okay, Lugansk, um, Lugansk, Donetsk, Kherson,
Kherson.
and Zaporizhia. Okay, these
Mm.
four oblasts or regions, and um, Putin more or less made that official, that requirement official back in June of last year. Now he's suggesting that, okay, look, we've made that, we've waited a whole year. If you don't accept this, we're going to move on. He didn't use those exact words, but essentially that's what he said. And not only, do you, okay, or you have to accept that we have these territories, but you need to recognize them as such. You mean they need to be internationally recognized as Russian territories. So he's been upping as time goes on. He's been upping the ante, and he's been very consistent about it. That's one thing, and very open. It's funny. Like you get all this talk. Well, the Russians will do this, and they'll just they'll agree to a freeze, or they'll we'll give them 10 years, and then we'll make Ukraine part of NATO, or we're going to send in French and British troops or whatever. It's just that the Russians have made it clear again and again and again consistently. They haven't wavered at all. They've all been on the same page. These are our requirements, and we've explained to you why they need to be respected. They were actually rather minimal in the past. Just asking for neutrality, but it's just like with everything that you've done, starting especially with the coup in 2014, and then the real breaching, the intentional refusal to implement the Minsk Accords, and then the tearing up of the Istanbul Agreement, and then just launching, turning this into a proxy war. Again, we know this is not just Ukraine being supported by the West, but this is Ukraine. It's like the West Army being provided the intelligence and the battle plans and everything. You try to actually bring us down. That's what the stated objective was. With the economic warfare and the military attacks, you actually attempted to destroy, cause the collapse of the Russian government. Okay, that's failed, and we saw what you were trying to do. And so, we have every reason to be suspicious of your intentions, and we're not going to give up to what we've taken. And in fact, we're demanding more.
Do you think the reason that it's so difficult to meet Russia's demands is because it would be just an admission that NATO lost, that the West is no longer the ultimate power in the world, the Western world, Western hegemony is over?
Yeah, I think that's probably it. I mean, that's the problem. Of course, we have admitted that we lost in other wars. We pulled out of Vietnam, we pulled out of Afghanistan, but in Vietnam, of course, we sent our own troops there. So that was an admission of failure, and it was hard to do. It was very unpopular, but in the end, we did it. And so, yeah, this is similar. We've been deeply involved. It will be hard to accept this failure, but we can. We've accepted the fact that we've lost these wars in the past. It just doesn't come easy. It took years of negotiations between the North Vietnamese and the Americans before the Americans finally relented and say, yeah, we're just getting out of here. Just let us go. And I think maybe we're looking at something similar here. Nobody wants to be the president that lost the war. But you also have to accept reality, and it's costing us a lot in many different ways. And so it makes a lot of sense. Again, Trump could, and I think sometimes makes kind of clumsy efforts to frame it as Biden's war. He used that, I think, that language, quite directly recently. He should have just come out of the gate saying, this is Biden's war. I'm out of here. This didn't make sense. This was stupid. It was, and sometimes he does say things like that. It's just that there's, I think, a real incoherence in his administration. There are people that that support that position. I think you can look at, but then there are others who don't, that are just part of the old establishment, and they can't accept a loss. They just don't want to, and they still believe that somehow they can win this war.
So will this just continue, do you think, until it gets to a point where we're forced to submit? The longer it goes on, though, the more painful and difficult it will be to extricate yourself from it, though, right? For Trump to say,
Yeah,
okay,
so
yeah,
that's
we
right.
have
I
to
think
admit.
he should have just right at the very beginning said, "This is Biden's war. I'm the president. This shouldn't have happened," and just he could have laid out all the reasons why this was a stupid mistake on our part. Obviously didn't work. They had this intention. They were going to cause the collapse of it. It hasn't worked, and the Ukrainians are being pulverized. And in spite of the huge amount of weapons and funds and intelligence and planning and even special operations forces and so on and so forth that we and the Brits and others have sent there, we're losing this war. There's really nothing else we can do. Okay, they miscalculated. It was, hey, it's actually back, like Obama actually kind of understood this. I think he was reluctant to send weapons to Ukraine, and he was asked why. He said it's because the Russians have escalatory dominance there. Meaning it's like we can up it, but they can always up it more. It's existential. It's their own backyard. We can't win the war there. That's what he said. And he was right about that. And I think there were other, people in the Pentagon. He was probably told that by people in the Pentagon. And Trump could just go back to that and say, yeah, he doesn't want to give any credit to Obama, of course, but he could, find people in the Pentagon that support him. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And he could say, this was a terrible miscalculation. This guy who's obviously suffering dementia took us into a war that all our smart people told him not to do. This was a real blunder, a strategic blunder of historical proportions. And we got to make an end to it. And if he could just do that consistently and cogently, he would find supporters, like again in the Pentagon, and he would be right. And I think you would have people screaming, but I think he clearly could have his way, and then you could just be out of it.
Well,
But the thing is, yeah, I mean, there's a real, like I say, an incoherence. A lot of the people that he chose, some of them were good, at least on Russia, but others are just like the Biden people. And so you're hearing everything, a lot of conflicting statements, and conflicting statements coming out of his own mouth, because I think he's hearing conflicting arguments are coming in and, both ears. And so that doesn't bode well. I just don't think that we're going to get an agreement. I never thought so. But yeah, I'm sure we won't now.
yeah, I mean, if you say that, he needs to lay it out consistently and cogently, those are two words I would not use to describe,
Right,
Trump.
exactly. That's exactly true. I mean, that's the sad truth. Yeah.
So you don't believe that that this war is just going to become Trump's war? I mean, I guess it already is now becoming Trump's war, and it's just going to continue to drag on. Russia is gearing up for what looks like a major offensive. They'll continue to plow through, and then all of a sudden, what happens then? Do we just let the whole thing collapse on Trump's watch, or do you think he's going to do what he can to prop it up and keep it going?
Well, that's the problem. Again, I think he has a real fear. See, if he had just gotten out of it early and actually, again, made an agreement with the Russians, or, said, okay, we accept with the Putin's demands of June, right? So again, it's the four oblasts plus Crimea, and no NATO ever, right? And well, I think it would have been sabotaged by the Ukrainians and the Europeans, but he could say, okay, well, look, this is agreement I made. You guys are sabotaging it. It's your problem. And it would be their problem at that point. But failure to reach an agreement, and then the danger is that, what will happen is that, of course, what definitely is going to happen, I would say, is that the Russians are not going to stop at the four oblasts, but they're going to keep on going, because in an absence of agreement, they just see that they don't have any choice. If you can't have a real settlement, then, then if you can't achieve anything through negotiation, you just have to achieve it on the battlefield, and they're gonna go all the way. And I think again, Nikolaev, Odessa, probably Kharkov as well. And then that's going to be harder it's going to look bad. It's something that Trump doesn't want to happen on his watch, because people will say, oh, it's because, look, you were weak, or it's because you did, or because you didn't give them the full support, or maybe you slowed down the flow of arms, or, or whatever. He's going to be roundly attacked. So that's the danger. And I'm sure a lot of people are probably telling him that right now. It's like, you got to support them all out. You got to make it clear that you're fully supporting them, because if you're accused of backstabbing them, that's what the other side is going to say. That's just not going to play well. And yeah, I think he made a real mistake, just not going out of the gates and saying this is Biden's war from the start, and just he could have just drawn a sharp line right then and there. But he's made a mess of it. Again, it's just because he's got different factions within his administration, and it's just reflected in his own kind of confused and inconsistent statements.
So what do you think is more likely, a negotiated deal between Russia, U.S., Ukraine, or the Iran nuclear deal? Do you...
I honestly
answer.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think they're both unlikely, but I honestly think that it's maybe a little bit more likely that you get an Iran deal of some sort.
Really? You really think so?
Well, yeah, because the thing is, the war hasn't actually started yet, and it's going to be tough. Like I said, for all the reasons that I gave last time, but I think, see, in this case, the war hasn't started, and I think Iran clearly doesn't want this war to happen. And there are people, we've seen them, they've been fighting off the anti-Iran hawks for decades now. People within the Pentagon and I think to a lesser extent within the State Department that do not want war with Iran. And so there is a chance that they'll be able to just hold it off, and come up with some sort of face-saving agreement, something that again Trump can claim. Look, I got a great deal here. It may be exactly the same deal that he tore up during his first term, but he can at least spin it that way and then walk away from it, because again we've seen again with Trump, he's reckless. He sometimes shows signs of having a messiah complex. We've talked about all these things, but then he's also, I don't think he's crazy, and I think he could be convinced that, hey, this is going to be disastrous. Just as he pulled away from at least a lot of, not all of, but a lot of the tariff war, he could be convinced to pull away from a war with Iran. I mean, again, I think maybe the right people get to him and say, this will just tank the world economy, and it's going to, the U.S. naval ships will sink, and it's going to look real, real bad. Let's not do this. Okay, just talk tough, and then let's make some agreement, and then forget about this. I screw Netanyahu. Yeah, and
we'll see. I mean, it just it depends on like who he has in his ear, and it sounds like and what I'm afraid of is just what I've been seeing. Is it sounds like there's more and more that the Zionists are really the ones that have his ear, and maybe they're able to convince him. Yeah. So and it'll be difficult to accept the JCPOA again. It'll probably be the same thing, but with more concessions. I think the Iranians are demanding sanction relief, and I think that would have to be done up front, right, because they also don't have trust. And Trump always was blaming Biden, like Biden gave them billions of dollars, and if he does, it's going to be difficult. We'll see. Right. But I mean, you have been cynical on. I was fairly confident that Trump would be able to end the war in Ukraine, and you said no. And like it's not going to be so easy. It's not going to happen. And you're proving it to be right. You know, your cynicism seems to be well founded. And so you're making me a cynic. It's a depressing life. I don't
Yeah.
like it, but it seems that that's the realism of it as well. It just seems to be that's the case. So, and I'm just afraid what the tariff war goes is not going to go well. It's going to be a loss. You know, what's happening in Ukraine, the longer it goes on, it's going to look really bad on Trump. What's happening in the Middle East is not looking good either. When it just, everything seems to be falling down is when I'm afraid Trump is just going to be like, screw it, I'm pushing the big red button. And then that's, you know, maybe that won't ever happen. But that's just what I mean. You get to a point where you're just like, you know what? Maybe let's just do the grandest reset of them all. We're just going to blow up the world and start again because it's
Yeah.
such a mess.
Right. Well, I mean, like he's almost done that to the world economy or threatening to do it. So it's just like, I don't know. I mean, there's stuff that nobody really could have imagined.
Mm,
Yeah, you know, he's displayed some very, very reckless behavior. So yeah, there is reason to be concerned. I don't know. It's very, very hard to predict the man. You know, he's not. I think, like you said, probably like the two words that you want to associate it with him above all are inconsistency and incoherence. So that just makes it difficult to say, you know, with any sort of confidence what's going to happen.
right. Yeah, don't try to read. Don't try to dive in his mind.
Yeah,
It'll drive you crazy. It's
right.
it's hard. Okay, Dad. Well, thanks a lot for the history lesson. I learned a lot. I'm sure people that listen learned a lot. So, thanks for all the knowledge. And yeah, we'll try to do maybe an episode on Friday. I'll let you know. My schedule is still a little crazy. Okay. Well, have a good rest of your day, and
Okay.
I'll talk to you
You
when I
too.
talk to you.
All
Okay.
right.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.